this evening. We're going to take our hymnal. Let's go ahead and stand. We're going to go to 328 and our hymnal 328 at Calvary. 328 at Calvary. 328 at Calvary. Gotta mute those phones, people. Years of vanity and pride, carrying on my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me He died on Calvary. Oh, mercy that was raining grace was great. My body's soft and liberty at Calvary. By God's word and last for sin I learned. Then I trembled at the law I spurned, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Oh, mercy that was great and grace was free. Free. Lord, and they were multiplied to me. Me. There, my body's soft and liberty. Glory. Now that third. Now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly own Him as my King. Now my rapture soul can only sing of Calvary. Oh, mercy that was great and grace was free. Free. Lord, and they were multiplied to me. Me. There my body's soft and liberty at Calvary. Now that last. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty of the Godhead span at Calvary. Oh, mercy that was great and grace was free. Free. Lord, and they were multiplied to me. Me. There my body's soft and liberty at Calvary. Excellent. Let's go just do one more. Let's just turn a page over. 329. He's the wonderful Savior to me. 329. I was lost in sin, but Jesus rescued me. He's a wonderful Savior to me. I was bound by fear, but Jesus set me free. He's a wonderful Savior to me. For ahead and remain standing, and we'll go ahead and have a word of prayer and get ready to have our offertory time. Brother Chris, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for today and a chance to be in your house again tonight. Bless the time we have together. Bless the offering, Lord. Thank you, Lord, for being such a wonderful Savior to us. We love the time, Lord, in Jesus' name.
Amen. Go ahead and please be seated. Thanks, Stephen. That's very nice. We're going to, we started last week with a lesson that we're going to be doing. We started our Old Testament survey or a walk through the Bible, whichever one you want to call it, but Old Testament survey basically. And we're going to continue that, but what we're going to do is the way I'm going to do the Old Testament survey is I'm going to interject videos that basically have to do with that particular subject throughout the thing. There's two things. Last week we talked about creation, and there's two main points that Satan really tries hard to give no credit to, and that one is creation. And so the book of Genesis and then the book of Revelation. Of course, he also tries to push away salvation and some other stuff. There's his lies. But creation is one of them, because if you do away with creation, then you do away with the Creator. And so tonight, what we're going to do, there's a guy that he was, and he'll talk a little bit about it. His name is Lee Strobel. He is a newspaper reporter. He did the movie, well, they did a movie about his life, The Case for Christ. His wife got saved. He tried to prove Jesus Christ and all that he has done is false. And so now he has this video that we're going to show. We're not going to show the whole thing, so I'll probably stand up and then we'll stop part of it. It's about 55 minutes long, and so we're going to watch just part of it. We're just going to watch the first part of it, and we'll see if we'll watch the second part or not. We might not. But I thought it was interesting, and so.
I've always been a logical and curious kind of person. I mean, that's just my personality. I remember when I was little, my parents gave me an electric train for Christmas. And then a couple hours later, my dad finds me in the garage, and I'm throwing the locomotive against the cement floor, trying to break it open. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to figure out how it works." I mean, my parents, because of all the why questions I would ask, finally went out and said, "Here," and they bought me an encyclopedia and said, "Look, the answers are in there. Go look for them. Go find them yourself." I mean, that's just the way I was. And so I guess it's natural that I would become a journalist, because journalists are looking for facts, they're looking for evidence, they're looking for data, they're looking for something that they can publish in the paper and have confidence it is true.
Lee Strobel earned a Master of Studies in Law degree from Yale Law School and is the former legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He is the best-selling author of several books that explore the evidence for the Christian faith.
I guess given my curiosity, it's not surprising that when I was in high school, science was my favorite topic, because there the teachers actually encouraged me to cut open frogs and find out how things work, which I thought was great. When I was a teenager, I had this deep trust in science, and I think part of it was prompted by the fact that I grew up in post-Sputnik America, where Eisenhower encouraged all young people to delve into science so we could catch up with the Russians. So to me, science sort of represented the empirical, the hard facts, the things that could be proven experimentally, and that was sort of the way in which I looked at life. I thought people who had faith, people who believed in supernatural things like God, I saw that as a sign of weakness, because, do you have any data to back that up?
In the autumn of 1966, Strobel's interest in science led to a life-changing decision.
I can take you back to the exact spot where I was sitting. It was in the third floor, overlooking the asphalt parking lot. I was in the second row, the third chair from the front, when my biology teacher recounted in great detail this experiment that had been conducted in the early 1950s at the University of Chicago.
This experiment that impressed Strobel so deeply was one of the most famous in the history of science. In 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate chemistry student, tried to demonstrate how life first emerged on Earth. Miller attempted to reproduce the Earth's early atmosphere. He pumped hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and a small amount of water vapor into a maze of glassware. Then sparked the gases with electrical discharges to simulate lightning. After 5 days, he discovered what he had hoped for: a few simple amino acids, the basic building blocks of living organisms, had collected in the dark residue at the bottom of the glass. Many hailed Miller's experiment as proof that essential components of life could have formed in the oceans of the Earth billions of years ago.
The philosophical implications of Miller's experiment were instantly obvious to me. And for me, it was a eureka moment because I heard this and I thought, wait a minute. If you can show scientifically that life can emerge without any outside assistance, if life can emerge just from naturalistic circumstances, then God was out of a job. From there, the acceptance of Darwinian evolution, and full-blown atheism for that matter, was pretty easy. Because if living organisms could emerge by themselves out of this primordial soup without the assistance of any kind of a god or supernatural intervention, then they certainly could develop naturally over the eons into more and more complex creatures, just as Charles Darwin theorized in his book On the Origin of Species.
As Strobel embraced Darwinism and its atheistic implications, he was surprised to discover that many Christians believed their faith was compatible with Darwinian evolution.
There's no way you can harmonize neo-Darwinism with Christianity. I could never understand Christians who would say, well, you know, I believe in God, and yet I believe in evolution as well. You see, Darwin's ideas about the development of life led to his theory that modern science now generally defines as an undirected process, completely devoid of any purpose or plan. Now, how could God direct an undirected process? How could God have purpose and a plan behind a system that has no plan and no purpose? It just does not make sense. Didn't make sense to me in 1966, and it doesn't make sense to me now.
In 1972, Lee Strobel married Leslie Herdler. 5 years later, Leslie, an agnostic, became a Christian.
And I thought, this is divorce. This is going to be the end of our marriage. But all the negative things I expected to happen in her as a result of her newfound faith, they didn't happen. And instead, I saw positive changes in her values and her character and the way she related to me and the children. And I thought, wait a minute. She is attributing this to God. And I don't believe God exists. And so that was the main thing that prompted me to say, maybe I need to really investigate this and get to the bottom of this and determine, is there really any rational way I could ever believe that this kind of a God really exists and really causes this kind of transformation in a human being? And so I decided to use my legal training and journalism training, my scientific curiosity, to systematically investigate, is there any credibility to the Christian faith?
Because science had played such an instrumental role in his turn to atheism, Strobel embarked on an investigation of major discoveries in biology, chemistry, cosmology, and physics. His studies spanned more than 20 years and included interviews with scientists and scholars as he sought to determine for himself what these discoveries implied about the reality of a creator. Throughout his inquiry, one question remained constant. Does the evidence uncovered by contemporary science point us toward or away from the existence of God?
Two-time Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling once said that science should be the search for truth. And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know where the evidence was ultimately going to take me, but I really did want to know the truth about God. And what I found shocked me, and it stunned me.
Strobel's search began with an examination of evidence that challenged materialistic theories of life's origin. He discovered that this negative evidence contradicted the textbook explanations that had once convinced him the blind forces of evolution could account for the creation and diversity of life on Earth.
A good example of negative evidence is the 1953 Origin of Life experiment by Stanley Miller, the one that helped lead me into atheism in the first place. As biologist Jonathan Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today, namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in it a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes you think that a few amino acids dissolved in the ocean are going to give you a living cell? It's totally unrealistic.
Stanley Miller's experiment was not the only unsuccessful attempt to explain how life originated. Beginning with Russian chemist Alexander Oparin's work in the 1920s, theorists have also proposed chance, chemical attraction, and biological seeding from outer space as possible answers. Each has failed to account for how non-living chemicals could have arranged themselves into the most basic components of the first living cell. Strobel's research ultimately led him to conclude that materialistic explanations for the origin of life were deeply flawed. And his examination of negative evidence did not end with the question of first life. He also learned of weaknesses in the most celebrated icon of Darwinian evolution.
In Darwin's book on the origin of species, there's only one illustration. It's called the Tree of Life. Darwin used it to explain how every species of animal and plant that ever existed on Earth had evolved from the same common ancestor through small, gradual steps over enormous periods of time. Even though Darwin's Tree of Life is included in virtually every biology textbook published over the last half-century, contrary to what we've been told, there is no conclusive evidence of the common origin of all life.
Perhaps the most damaging blow to Darwin's theory is the fossil record. If all living organisms have descended from the same primitive life form, then the rock strata of the Earth should be filled with the fossilized remains of animals that were once part of a great evolutionary chain. A chain of small biological modifications, ultimately leading to a spectacular diversity of life. Yet, after 2 centuries of research, highlighted by excavations in southern China, the multitude of transitional experiments, or missing links, that should exist are conspicuous only by their absence. The most graphic example of this void in the fossil record is a geological era known as the Cambrian explosion.
The branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory is actually not seen anywhere in the fossil record unless we impose it with our own minds. So the Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the tree of life.
The Cambrian explosion of life was a dramatic episode in geological history. Usually dated at about 530 million years ago, the exquisitely preserved Cambrian fossils reveal that the body plans for virtually every major animal phyla appeared, not gradually and slowly as Darwin had speculated, but instead with astonishing suddenness.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
In a geological instant, the animal kingdom leaped from small, relatively simple organisms to extraordinary creatures with spinal cords, compound eyes, and articulated limbs. The record of this explosion of life looks nothing like Darwin's slowly branching tree.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now, within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification. But even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life. As scientists, it's not our job to force the evidence into a theory that just doesn't fit it. And so I have absolutely no desire or reason to uphold Darwin's theory at this point.
I think what we're seeing today is a series of scientific discoveries that are opening the eyes of more and more scientists to say, wait a minute, I can no longer believe that pure naturalistic processes can account for the origin and diversity of life. There must be something else here.
The challenges to Darwinian theory have led more than 600 scientists with PhDs from major universities throughout the world to sign a document titled A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. It reads in part, "We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life."
These are scientists with PhDs from Stanford and Berkeley and University of Chicago and Cambridge, major universities, who've looked hard and fast at the evidence and have walked away saying, I am not convinced. Maybe there's another explanation. Personally, the negative evidence forced me to conclude that Darwinism would require a blind leap of faith that I just had no good reason to make.
Strobel's rejection of Darwinism and materialistic science was also based on the large body of positive evidence for intelligent design. Evidence he first confronted in the science of cosmology, which explores the origin of the universe.
How did the universe begin? What is its source? Few questions have generated as much controversy through the centuries or inspired as many impassioned opinions. I interviewed William Lane Craig, a philosopher who has devoted much of his career to the study of cosmology and the question of origins.
From ancient Greek materialism at the time of Plato and Aristotle up through 19th century idealism, the prevailing view was that the universe is eternal, that the universe never began to exist, that the universe as a whole is, as it were, a static, timeless entity.
This belief in an eternal, unchanging universe, for centuries a pillar of Western cosmology, was unexpectedly challenged in 1915 by Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity. Einstein's equations implied a startling possibility. The cosmos was not static, but instead existed in a continual state of either contraction or expansion.
Einstein did not like the idea that the universe was dynamic at all. In fact, like almost all scientists at the time, in the early 20th century, he assumed the universe was static and eternal. What's interesting and ironic is that he thought he had made some kind of mistake in his equations for the general theory of relativity. But a few years after he developed the theory, a Belgian astronomer named Lemaitre developed a model based upon his equations, which again predicted that the universe was in a continual state of expansion.
In 1929, theoretical predictions were confirmed with empirical data. At the Mount Wilson Observatory overlooking Los Angeles, astronomer Edwin Hubble studied light from distant galaxies. Hubble determined that galaxies beyond our Milky Way were moving away from us at a speed proportional to their distance from the Earth. The more distant the galaxy, the faster it is receding. Hubble's landmark discovery led most astronomers and physicists, including Albert Einstein, to a similar conclusion. If the universe is continually expanding, then at earlier points in its history, it must have been smaller and denser.
I think a good way to visualize this is to imagine that the history of the universe has somehow been photographed and made into a movie that we could play on a projector. As the projector runs forward, we watch the universe as it continually expands. But if the projector were to be stopped and were switched into reverse to make the movie run backward, then instead of watching the galaxies move farther and farther apart from each other, we'd see them draw closer and closer together.
As you trace this expansion back in time, the universe grows denser and denser and denser until finally the entire known universe is contracted down to a state of infinite density, which marked the beginning of the universe. At this point, which cosmologists call the singularity, all matter and energy, physical space and time themselves came into being. This literally represents the origin of the universe from nothing. So the startling implication of Hubble's discovery was the temporal finitude of the universe, that the universe had an absolute beginning at some point in the finite past.
During the second half of the 20th century, other discoveries also pointed to a universe with a beginning. These images of the cosmic microwave background radiation document what most scientists now believe is the remnant heat generated during the universe's early history. Background radiation is found throughout the cosmos and indicates its expansion from a sudden, perhaps violent moment in time. This evidence for a finite universe has reaffirmed the conclusion of an ancient philosophical deduction. It is called the Kalam cosmological argument.
The Kalam argument is deceptively simple in its formulation. It consists of basically 3 steps. Premise 1 is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Premise 2 is that the universe began to exist. And the remarkable development that has occurred is that for the first time, we now have solid scientific evidence for the truth of that second premise, that the universe began to exist. And from those 2 premises, it follows logically, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. And that points to a reality beyond the universe, a transcendent reality beyond space and time, and therefore non-physical and immaterial, which created the universe out of nothing and brought it into being.
The implications of a finite universe, coupled with other discoveries of modern cosmology, have led many scientists to unmistakably theological conclusions.
There is no ground for supposing that matter and energy existed before and were suddenly galvanized into action. It is simpler to postulate creation ex nihilo, divine will constituting nature from nothingness.
The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply, at a definite moment in time, in a flash of energy and light.
We can't understand the universe in any clear way without the supernatural.
Supernatural creation of the universe in a flash of energy and light. You know, it sounds an awful lot like the first chapter of Genesis to me. Today, the vast majority of even the most skeptical astronomers and cosmologists believe that the universe had a beginning. This belief isn't based on some theological doctrine. It's based on scientific evidence. And I think if we follow the evidence wherever it points clearly and powerfully and persuasively in the direction of a creator.
Since the beginning of time, all the matter in the universe has been governed by precisely balanced laws and constants. During an interview with Robin Collins, a philosopher with degrees in mathematics,
trying to reproduce the Big Bang Theory, the Big Bang reaction. There is a large place, and I think it's Sweden, called the Large Hadron Collider, just giant circular thing on the ground, underground, and they shoot photons and atoms at each other and try to get them to explode. And they've been doing it for years and years and years, and they can't get it to do it. Just like the one guy back in the 50s that put the stuff in a bottle, put sparks in it, and down below it forms a, oh, well, there you go, it's all done. Well, okay, no, it's not the exact, probably chemicals that were around, they say, when there was nothing. So, okay. The other thing, too, is two verses that I thought of for this is in Psalms chapter 8, verse number 3. In Psalm chapter 8, verse number 3, it says, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained." Okay? And then the other one is in Isaiah chapter 40, verse number 22. Isaiah 40, verse number 22. "It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth." All right? Okay, the earth is circular, guys, not flat. Okay, I know some of you guys think it might be flat, but I know it's circular. The Bible says so. "And the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in." So God has stretched out the heavens. So when you talk about it being from a beginning and then expanding, and Einstein's theory of relativity is the universe is expanding, you know what's going to happen? It's going to contract again eventually one day, and it's going to expand to a point where we're not going to expand anymore. Okay, that's all I kind of got as far as that. Anybody else have any thoughts or anything about that's kind of interesting that you might may have caught?
Well, just what you just said was the most interesting for me is that people like Einstein and a bunch of people, you know, that I don't even know, believe that in expansion and all this stuff, and they have these great theories that are their own and whatever, but it's proven in the Bible already.
Right.
It's already been in the Bible long, thousands of years before these people existed.
Right.
And it's just so much proof
Right.
of our God's existence, and it's
Well,
undeniable.
And you do away with creation, you do away with God, then you do away with having to be under God and
Right.
His judgment.
Right.
God made the rules. We just, our job is to follow what they are, and so we can, like, I don't know how many scientists they said signed that thing, that paper saying that they basically refute all of Darwin's theories, and yet that has been taught in schools since the early 1900s, 1920s. They started teaching some of that and so forth. So there's a lot of that, and then you talk to people about it, they'll just believe it without having any kind of proof of anything at all. So which is kind of really ridiculous, but whatever, because they don't want to have to believe in God either. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You believe in creation, it's either creation or a creator, or it all happened by chance. You know.
And that's exactly why people don't want to believe. It's too scary to believe that there's a God.
Right.
It's interesting that people talk about Christianity or religion as a whole being a crutch for those who are weak. And actually, there's a pastor in California, Brother Mike Ray, wrote a book, I believe. I think it's a book. Something about I'm too afraid not to believe or something like that.
Oh,
I
right.
can't remember. I'm trying to get that book, but I can't seem to get it. I gotta get hold of them. Anyway, people don't want to believe because they're scared.
Right.
Because it would be scary to believe there's a being out there that has power over absolutely everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. So, anyways, I didn't want to do the whole thing. It's about 55 minutes long. I didn't think we needed to. I just thought just a piece of it had some interesting things about it. Anybody else have a thought or something they want to say? No? All right, why don't we go ahead and have a word of prayer? And then we'll just go ahead and dismiss. Let's pray. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your love and direction. Thank you so much for your word. We can trust it. We can believe it. What the Bible says. I thank you so much that we can believe without doubt that there really truly is a creator, and we can by believing in Jesus Christ become one of the sons of God. And I thank you for that. I pray to the Lord as you just guide and direct, to be with us,